Steal the rental negotiation playbook that I've used to open up multiple locations for my cash-based practice profitably and without taking on excessive overhead or getting caught in a bad rental agreement. Let's dive in. All right, guys, so the purpose of this training is to provide a structured approach for you guys to be able to negotiate leases for your cash-based practice. This essentially ensures that all lease agreements are favorable, cost-effective, and aligned with the clinic's long-term goals. Essentially, we want you to be able to enter an agreement that you feel good about and one that is going to help you sustain long-term profitability within your practice while you're within this space. All right. Too often we see clinic owners get into a bad rental agreement and it essentially wipes out all the profit that they had and really puts they're doing great on everything else within their practice and doing everything they can, but at the end of the day, they can't change their lease agreement. And so this is one of the most important things to be well structured within your practice and something you don't want to get wrong. So I'm gonna walk you through all the things that you need to make sure that you're not gonna holes that you're going to step in, issues that are going to arise down the road. Want to make sure that you avoid all the mistakes that a lot of clinic owners step into. All right. So it really comes down to prep. So make sure that you're not doing all this on your own. Work with a realtor. Always work with a realtor. There's literally no cost to you. So how it works is a realtor is going to be working for you. If and when this deal closes, the landlord actually dishes out the compensation for them. Usually it's 3% for their representing realtor and 3% for the realtor that's representing you. Okay, again, the landlord covers all these costs. So there's no downside to working with a realtor. They know the market better than you do, most likely, and they're going to be able to help you figure out what is a fair rental agreement, what is a fair cost per square foot, et cetera, et cetera. All right. So how do you go about finding a realtor? Ideally a referral, like a friend or family member that knows of a great realtor, or another business owner that's worked with a realtor, or ideally talk to your patients. Most likely if you give your patients a heads up that, hey, I'm thinking about moving into our own space or moving to a different space, they most likely have a realtor that they could refer to you. Okay. Another thing too is just do a simple Google search. Look at reviews, just the same way that patients find you. Most likely a Google search in a lot of cases. Do a Google search for a commercial realtor within your area. All right. So, and then obviously read reviews, yada, yada. All right. So market research, you also, along with realtor, you want to be doing your own market analysis. Okay. But again, lean on the realtor as much as you possibly can for this. All right. So what I did is I go on LoopNet. LoopNet is a realtor site that allows you to be able to identify open commercial spaces in your area or the area that you are looking at. And it allows you to identify current market trends and the average lease rates in the area so you know what is fair. Okay? Also, what you want to do here is research comparable properties to understand competitive lease terms. Sometimes it's a landlord's market, sometimes it's a tenant's market. And so this can fluctuate depending on what's going on in the US and with the economy and all that. All right? So that fluctuates. So another thing you want to do is you need to assess what are your needs? What is the clinic's needs? All right, determine the specific requirements of the space. Okay, how much space do we need? What's the location that we want to be in? And then you also want to forecast future growth and what you might need in the future. All right, so rule of thumb is about 500 square feet per full-time practitioner. And then I like to add on an additional 500 square feet just to be safe. I'd rather be roomier and have more room than not. All right. So for example, if you have 3 full-time PTs, you're going to ideally want 2,000 or more, between 2,000 and 2,500 square feet. So for example, 3 times 500 is 1,500, and then you add another 500 square feet on that to be safe. You're right around that 2,000 square foot. Another metric you want to use is rent and overhead should make up about 5 to 10% of your revenue. All right. So if you're generating $100,000 a month, then your rent would be ideally between $5,000 to $10,000 per month. Okay. Let's say that you're generating $50,000 within your practice. Then you ideally want your rent to be between $2,500 to $5,000. There is a caveat here that you can sometimes go up to that 10 to 15% or up to that 15% mark if you know that you're going to be able to grow into it within the next 12 to 18 months. You don't want to be sitting in that for if you sign a 5-year lease, you don't want to be sitting at 15, 20% throughout the duration of that lease. The time that you want to enter closer to that 15% mark is if you know and you're confident you're going to be able to grow into that and increase your revenue because of it. So for simple numbers, this is most likely maybe high for you. Let's say you're generating $100,000 per month in your practice. You could take on, what would that be, $15,000 per month in rent if you know that you are eventually going to be able to increase that up to $150,000 per month. Okay, it'll bring it down close to that 10% mark. So again, anticipate growth that you're anticipating over the next couple of few years. Then you also want to review legal requirements. Ensure compliance with the local zoning laws and regulations. This is a big one. A lot of times, especially if you are in downtown areas, there's going to be zoning laws that don't allow medical practices to be within that zone. So make sure that you are working with the city, and a lot of times you can go to the city's website and look up the different zoning regulations and see what fits. Sometimes you can also negotiate with and talk with the city about getting a conditional zoning law where even though you technically don't fit in that zoning law, you can make an argument and talk with them, and sometimes they'll still let you in. But there is a process to it, and it's a lengthy process. And that's another thing too. I encourage you guys to make sure that if you are thinking about moving, that you do this within at minimum 12 months in advance. Okay, this stuff takes time. You also want to make sure you're not rushing into something or rushing into a rental agreement. So ideally 12 months at a minimum is the runway time that you want for this. Ideally more. Sweet spot is around 18 months. Because again, you don't want to be out working in a state of desperation here. Also, you want to make sure that you are consulting with a lawyer to understand lease clauses and their implications. Working with a realtor is great, but when you get closer to signing that lease, you want to make sure that you are also working with a lawyer to review some of the terms and making sure that everything is good to go from a legal standpoint. So diving into negotiation strategy, this is really important. Obviously, we want to set clear goals. So before we go into negotiations, we want to identify the key objectives of the negotiation. Are we focused on, that's one thing too, is there's a misconception that the only thing that you can negotiate on is rent. That is not the case. We're going to go through all different things, that different levers that you can pull to get better terms that are going to bring down your costs than just focusing on rent. So obviously you can negotiate rent, you can negotiate better terms, maintenance responsibilities, yada yada. We'll go over these different things that you can negotiate on. But identify your key objectives and what are most important to you. Like tenant improvements. Tenant improvements, or TI, is essentially what renovations are you going to have to make to the space? How much can we negotiate with the landlord to cover those costs? Sometimes they'll cover 50%, sometimes 100, sometimes 0. It can fall anywhere within that range. So that's another big negotiation piece as well. So again, prioritize what is most important to you and your practice. So prepare the negotiation plan, outline the negotiation strategy, including potential concessions and fallback positions. Develop a list of questions and concerns to address during negotiations. So you really want to know, what is your breaking point, right? What are you absolutely unwilling to do? What is an absolute deal breaker? You want to make sure you have that outlined before you go into these negotiations. Identify stakeholders, engage key stakeholders. So include like input from your staff and your realtor, and obviously the landlord too. And then you want to also designate a primary negotiator and supporting team. So I hired on somebody that specializes in this. He actually wrote the book on how to commercial lease negotiations for dummies, one of those books. And so you can also hire this out and hire on a professional negotiator to help you with that. And most of the time they are going to, especially if it's a larger deal, the cost that that's what it is. It's an investment to work with these individuals. Like the cost that it was for me to hire this individual, he more than made back the money that it cost me to hire him. All right. So you also can hire a professional negotiator for you as well. And depending on the size of the space, it can or cannot make sense depending on how much there is an upside on them being able to save you money. So negotiation process: initial contact, schedule a meeting, arrange initial meetings with the landlord and their representative, prepare an agenda for each meeting. You want to present your case and clearly articulate the clinic's needs and objectives, provide supporting data and documentation to justify requests. Discuss in bargaining, negotiate key terms, discuss rent rates, lease duration, renewal options, and other critical terms, negotiate maintenance responsibilities and any potential improvements to the property, and address concerns. Listen to the landlord's concerns and counter proposals. Be prepared to offer concessions that are acceptable and beneficial to both parties. So when I go into negotiations, not just for lease negotiations, is I really want to ask as many questions and get into what is the landlord's main primary pain point for them and be able to capitalize on that. So for example, we recently entered into a rental agreement in the Oakland location, and one of the main pain points for the landlord is it's definitely a tenant's market. What I mean by that is there's a lot of vacancies within the area, and so that is a big pain point. They didn't want vacancy. They wanted this to be leased out as soon as possible. So I also was willing to move pretty quickly on this deal, and so that was something that was of value to this landlord, was because he wanted this vacancy filled as quickly as possible. Another one was a big one, was the space was already built out to how we wanted it to be. So we weren't to have to do a whole lot of tenant improvements or TI. The space was pretty much perfect as is. We weren't gonna have to put up walls, take down walls, anything like that. We just obviously had to outfit it. And at the end of the day, the landlord, if you're not having to put up walls, tear down walls, that's going to lower the total tenant improvement costs for them. And they knew that if the likelihood of them finding another tenant that wouldn't be asking for any tenant, or would be asking for most likely somebody else that would come in to potentially rent for the space, would want tenant improvements. We didn't want that. So that saves them literally hundreds of thousands of dollars. And so I made that very clear that that is something that we would not need. And then that allowed me to lower our rental rate. Our square footage rate was significantly lower than the average for the area because we didn't need tenant improvement. And so that was a big negotiation piece. So you want to make sure you're asking the landlord questions to really understand what are their main pain points. Instead of thinking about me, you need to go in and think about what benefit can I provide to this space that other tenants can't, and also what are the landlord's main pain points. Okay. Key lease terms and conditions. So again, there's other things outside of just rental rate or square footage rate. There's other things to leases that can bring down your costs and provide value to your space. So risk assessment. So really a space that is, especially for a landlord, that's only going to be 1 or 2 years rented out, that is a risk, because when that tenancy is up, now there's a risk for vacancy. And so a moderate risk would be 3 years agreement, a low risk would be 5 years. So I signed a 5-year agreement because I knew I was confident this space was going to be a long-term play for us, and I didn't want to have to move again in 2 years and do this all over again, especially when I knew this area was going to be great for us. And so it lowered the risk for the landlord by entering into this longer lease agreement, which allowed us to lower our square footage rental rate. So again, this was a pain point for the landlord. They wanted more long-term, they wanted more security, and the security was being a longer lease term. So lease payment responsibilities: ensure responsible for rent payments for the lease term. If business fails, negotiate lower lease terms for high-risk projects. So we'll dive into this down the page here, but essentially you want to also make sure that you have an out if something goes wrong with the business, that you're not, like if you sign a 5-year lease, that you can get out of that lease and not have to pay, like let's say it comes year 2 and something catastrophic happens and your business is no longer survivable and you need to shut it down. You don't want to be on the hook for the 3 years of rent. So you need to make sure that you are negotiating with that within there too. So how we had it set up is we weren't responsible for more than 6 months after giving our notice. And then it could be also less if they found a tenant earlier than that 6 months. Another big one is option to renew. So preferred options for you is ideally the first choice is 5-year renewals. So ideally like a 15-year option or a 10-year option. So you're in the space for the first 5 years, that's agreed upon, but you ideally want 2 5-year renewals. Okay, this also increases the value of your property, or sorry, not the property of your practice, especially if you decide that you want to sell in the next 10 to 15 years, 5 to 15 years, is it allows you pretty much to have first dibs on a renewal and being able to work with the landlord on renewing. Okay, so ideally you want 2 5-year renewals. So you got the space for 5 years, then you have another 5-year option, and then another 5-year option after that for a total of 15. So you're not locked into 10 or 15, you just have the option, okay, kind of first dibs. Second choice would be 1 5-year renewal. So we weren't able to negotiate the 2 5-year renewal. We were able to, our primary focus was trying to drive the cost per square foot down as much as possible. And the tenant or the landlord did not want to commit to 2 5-year renewals. So we agreed upon a 1 5-year renewal, which I was happy with as well. So again, always ask for a renewal option to maintain flexibility when the lease term is up. Early termination clause is kind of what I was talking about earlier, is if you have to terminate the clause or terminate the lease early, you want to be able to do that and not be on the hook for rent. So first choice would be 3 months of rent. So if you gave your landlord notice on like January 1st that you want to be out in 3 months, you would only be on the hook up and through March 31st of that year. Okay, that would be first choice. Not all landlords are going to go for that. The second choice would be 6 months worth of rent. Okay, and this is what we got. Negotiation point: ensure an early termination clause to leave the premises with minimal penalty if there's perceived risk. And even if there's not perceived risk, you want that in place as well. Fixture period, preferred options. First choice would be 4 months rent free. Second choice is 3 months rent free. So a lot of times the landlord would be open to giving you a couple months of free rent to allow you to have like a fixture period for tenant improvements. So like if you're doing any improvements to the space, being able to build that out for officially grand opening, that is something that you can negotiate the free rent, since there might be not revenue being generated while the renovations are being completed, and gives you time to do that. We were able to negotiate, even though we didn't have tenant improvements, we were still able to negotiate 1 month of free rent, because that was something that they knew that by being able to get us in earlier and securing us as a tenant, it decreased the risk of that being vacant for multiple months if we didn't move forward with that. All right. Restoration clause, negotiation point: never agree to restore premises to original condition upon lease termination. So let's say that you move into the space and you have to take down a bunch of walls. You don't want to have to get done with that lease and have to put those walls back up. That's going to be very costly. So you want to make sure that is not included in the lease. All right, renovation costs. Ideally, really what you can expect on average is around $50 to $150 per square foot of renovation costs. So if the space needs to be completely remodeled, you need to put up walls, stuff like that, and make it into what you need it for the practice, with a lot of changes, you can expect $50 to $150 per square foot. This is going to be a big cost, and that's why it's important, in my opinion. The main thing that I looked for was a space that I wasn't going to have to do a whole lot of tenant improvements. I wanted a space that had a great location, because you can't change location, and I also wanted a space where we wouldn't have to be taking down a whole bunch of walls, we wouldn't have to be putting up walls, restructuring it, anything like that, because that decreased our costs substantially. Because we moved into a 5,000 square foot facility, and let's say on average $100 per square foot, that's a $500,000 renovations potentially if you move into a space that needs a lot of work. And then a negotiation point, you can work with general contractors, but you want to make sure that you avoid large companies. I like to work with more of the mom and pop shops because they take pride in what they do more often than large companies. So that's a strategy there too. Exclusivity clause, so this is a big one, is if you were a physical therapy clinic, you want to make sure that no other physical therapy business or chiropractor or massage, acupuncture, whatever you view as a competitor, isn't able to move in right next door to you. Okay, that's something that is a big negotiation point, and make sure that the landlord can't lease space to another tenant offering the same services for competition purposes. Signage, exterior signage. Signage is not cheap. This is something that really surprised me on how expensive signage is. So ideally try and negotiate the landlord will pay for the signage. Second choice would be, obviously you pay, that'd be your backup, but first choice would see if you can get the landlord to cover the cost. Interior signage, this is like if you have the shared common space with high traffic, you want to make sure that you can also put up signage so people can find you more easily. Parking, this is a big one, especially if you are in a city and there's like validated parking. Like this was a big one for us, is there's validated parking. We're in uptown Oakland, and very high traffic, and parking is a real problem. Because of the validated parking, it makes it very easy for our patients. And so we didn't want to have to cover 100% of validated parking. That runs, I think it was like $12 an hour. And obviously if a patient's, they're gonna be there more than 60 minutes. Like they gotta park, they got to walk in, then they've got to leave their appointment. It's going to be closer to like an hour and 15. So we were going to do like an hour and a half, like we negotiated an hour and a half worth of time. So that was going to be $18 per hour that we were going to have to pay in parking validation. So ideally the thing is here is you want to negotiate 100% of the landlord covering the validated parking. We were able to negotiate 75%, which is really, really good. And I'm really happy with. So ideally you want, for validated parking, you want the landlord to be covering that as much as possible, because it does run costs up substantially. I think we're gonna have to pay like $8,000 with the volume that we're seeing of clients. It'd be $8,000 extra per month just for validated parking. But we were able to negotiate, so I think it's gonna be down to like I think it's $2,000, $2,500 per month for parking now versus 8,000. And then negotiating point, ensure adequate parking for your staff as well, not just for patients. Make sure that staff parking is negotiated in there too. Common area expenses, or CAM, or triple net. So there's some agreements that you have to also cover taxes, utilities, and basic common area costs. This is something that you want to identify if this is something that you have to cover or not, because it does increase expenses substantially. So your landlord will be, or your realtor will be able to help explain that further, but it's just essentially the landlord passes along taxes, utilities, and basic common area costs onto the tenant. Some do, some don't. Finalizing the lease, review the lease agreement, thoroughly review, ensure all negotiated terms are accurately reflected. Look for any ambiguous language or unfavorable clauses within this. So one thing that was, for example, something that they tried to kind of sneak in was HVAC. So if the HVAC went out, we were going to have to be on the hook for 100% of it. They also were asking us to do maintenance of the HVAC periodically. And so that was something that we discussed and negotiated on as well. So make sure that you understand your total costs, like the potential replacement for the HVAC, which can cost tens of thousands of dollars, making sure that that's in good working order, getting a report done on that so you can anticipate whether or not this is a new HVAC or something that you may have to replace during your lease agreement if you're on the hook for that. So little things like that. Legal review, have the lease agreement reviewed by legal counsel and address any legal concerns or recommendations. Something you can do too, I don't encourage you to rely solely on this, but I uploaded the lease agreement and to ChatGPT and said, you're legal counsel for commercial space, an expert in your space and in the area of legal counsel for commercial spaces. Identify problematic agreements or points within this agreement that you would advise your person that you're helping out with or your client, advising them on what to look out for and something to make sure you negotiate further on before signing. Next, if you want to sign the lease, ensure all parties sign the lease agreement, make copies of the signed lease for all involved parties. and then distribute the agreement. Make sure that you are saving this. Lastly is follow-up, implementation, monitoring, compliance, ensure adherence to all lease terms by both the clinic and the landlord. So for example, with our HVAC, we have to do quarterly inspections. So that's something that we have to make sure that we are doing. And so putting reminders in your calendar to make sure that those inspections are completed every single quarter, okay, depending on the agreement. And then periodic review, regular review lease terms, and then periodically review the lease agreements to ensure it continues to meet the clinic's needs, and prepare for future negotiations well in advance for the lease expiration date. So this is another one too, is again, just like I mentioned, you want at least 12 months of heads up when you're moving into a new space. You want to do the same thing when you are approaching the end of this lease. Starting that conversation early with your landlord, ideally around that, with 18 months left on your lease agreement, you want to start having conversations with your landlord around those things. So if you guys want a copy of this, go ahead and click the link below and we'll get this over to you. I'll see you guys next training. Bye guys.